Okay. So hey everybody, I'm Thomas Menander Richardson. People call me Richie. I am the Director of Research at Bryant Research. We are a social science think tank in the UK exclusively serving the animal advocacy movement and the alternative protein sector. And I am going to be talking to you about how we can build a plant-based, food-secure world. So raise your hand if you have ever eaten millet before. Have you ever eaten millet? Oh my God, people have eaten millet. I was actually expecting nobody to have eaten millet. It's a bit of an obscure food, but I had to go down to my local health food shop to buy millet, and I kind of boiled it and with some seasonings. It was chewy and nutty, a little bit gluey. It was okay. But why did I eat millet, right? I wanted to see what all the fuss was about, because the Indian government are a huge fan of millets. They call them Nutri-cereals. They also call them Shri Anna, which means revered grains, ancestral grains. President Modi has, or Prime Minister Modi has served it to international delegates, and in fact they have collaborated with the UN to declare 2023 the year of millet. So there's a big push for millets in India. And Bill and Melinda are also big fans of millets. We can see here, we got a little tweet by Bill Gates about how he's fascinated by these ancient grains. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funds these global health initiatives around bringing millets to the world's poorest. And so why do we care about millets? Well, millets are a solution to food security. They are nutri-cereals. They're a replacement for rice, but they are much higher in all forms in all sorts of nutrients. They're culturally sensitive. They're generally pretty good for you, and they are a plant-based food security solution. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. So food security is a concept that gets batted about everywhere. It can be, people kind of use it to mean whatever they want to mean. This is like a technical definition from the UN, and I've bolded the important bits, right? So it's the state in which all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Right, that's a mouthful, but really the things to emphasize here is it's about having access to food, being able to buy food. Food is in the shop, you can afford it. It is safe, it is culturally relevant, it's nutritious. So why should we care about food security? Well, food security is a huge component of the global health conversation. And so if you live in a lower middle income country, like your government certainly cares about food security. But it's increasingly a big conversation in high income countries too. So if you work in kind of like European policy work, in the UK, in the US, you're probably hearing more and more about food security. The UK government the UK House of Parliament mentioned food security like 9 times in 9 different debates last year. And so it's not really just a kind of poor country thing anymore. It's increasingly a conversation that we're all having. And unfortunately, factory farming uses food security arguments to its advantage to spread factory farming around the world and to entrench its positions in higher income countries. And so this is a narrative that we need to be getting involved with. We need to know the arguments, we need to make good arguments, and we ultimately need to win this debate. So the plan for today is I'm going to split the talk into 2 halves. We've got food security in low and middle income countries. There I'm going to be mostly focusing on micronutrients. I'm also going to be telling you about future smart foods and biofortified foods. And then I'm going to talk about food security in higher income countries. We've got things like self-sufficiency and imported soy feed. We've got a bit about affordable nutrition and how factory farming is totally irrelevant to this conversation. And lastly, how the role of a thriving farming sector in food security. I am aware that this kind of higher income countries, low middle income countries distinction is kind of arbitrary, and some of you might come from countries that are kind of in the middle. But really, these are 2 very different food security conversations. When people in high-income countries talk about food security, they often mean very different things to when we talk about food security in low and middle-income ones. So I think it makes sense to kind of separate this discussion out. However, you might be in a country where arguments from both bits of this talk are relevant, so feel free to kind of pick and choose. So firstly, food security in low and middle-income countries. So an argument we make that the plant-based movement, the vegan movement, makes a lot when it comes to food security is this idea that we feed too many calories to animals, and we could be feeding those calories to humans, and we don't have enough calories, so this is a good thing. But how many people do you think don't get enough calories worldwide, right? There's like 8 billion people, so I don't know, shout out what you think it is. 1 billion? 2 billion? What are we here? Okay. It is 673 million, which is about 8.2% of the world's population. That's a lot lower than what I was expecting when I found this out. And in fact, this is actually trending very positively. In fact, I've seen reviews of like different projections that suggest that we're almost certain to meet humanity's calorie needs by 2050, even without radical changes to agriculture. Like, people are quite confident we can do this. We don't need huge innovations, perhaps even with factory farming. We're actually on track to meet our calorie needs. However, how many people do you think don't get enough micronutrients? We're talking here like vitamins, minerals, that kind of thing. 6 billion? 6 billion. We got 2 billion? Yeah, so it's 2.7 billion people, much higher, about 34%. This obviously breaks down by world region. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, about up to 70% of the population cannot afford to meet their micronutrient needs. And even in higher income countries, we also find that quite a lot of people are micronutrient deficient too. And so the first thing I want to leave you with is that food security is less about calories, and it's more about nutrients, and more particularly affordable nutrition. So an example of a food security solution that I think is kind of cool are these things called future smart foods. They are quite ironically named because most of the time future smart foods are indigenous foods. They are foods that people in various countries have been eating for generations, but they were often forgotten and kind of almost wiped out in the rush of many low and middle income countries to produce as many calories as possible, right? A lot of these foods were gotten rid of to make more space for rice, for wheat, and for animal products. And so here we're talking about some things you may know. We're talking about like mung beans. Mung beans are a future smart food. We've got jackfruit up here. We've got ripe jackfruit. We've got snake gourd. Has anybody eaten snake gourd? You've eaten a snake? No way. Okay, cool. I didn't think I was, yeah. And that's pretty cool. And I haven't. And then we've also got our trusty millets. So the thing about future smart foods is that what makes them so smart is that they are often replacements for kind of grains and staples, but they are much higher in micronutrients. They are often adapted to the local climate. They are culturally sensitive, and so it's quite easy to get populations to adopt them because they're just going back to what their grandparents ate. And they are much, much healthier. One of the problems with future smart foods is that sometimes there can be a bit of cultural tension where people see them as kind of like old school food, like food from the past, and we want to usher in a new future of food. But as the Indian government has shown, you can tie it to your cultural identity, and you can get strong adoption of these plant-based nutrient kind of powerhouses. And the second thing, kind of on the other side, is biofortification. Right? This long word basically means we breed crops to have more micronutrients in them. Sometimes this is genetic modification, but other times this is just good old selective breeding. So we have they're very creatively named. We have like iron beans, which hopefully are not as hard as iron, but a large portion can provide up to 80% of your daily iron needs, right? People say you need red meat for iron, but not if you've got iron beans. But also they often have other benefits. For example, they can be high yielding, virus resistant, resistant to heat and drought, which is great if you're on a planet that is on fire. We also have, for example, zinc rice, which provides up to 40% of your daily zinc needs. Rice doesn't typically contain a lot of zinc, usually. And then lastly, vitamin A sweet potato. Often these sweet potatoes can provide up to 100% of your vitamin A needs, which is pretty amazing because lots of species of sweet potato contain no vitamin A whatsoever, right? We can just breed it into these things, right? So these are quite promising. These biofortified crops have been deployed in over 100 countries. They are quite, and we know that they work. And so this can also be a great way that we can sidestep this idea that we need animal products to meet our micronutrient needs, right? We can just build better plants. Lastly, an idea I kind of want to leave you with is, should the World Bank fund alternative proteins as a food security fix, right? So the World Bank put out this report called Recipe for a Livable Planet. Who has read this report? Or at least like pretended to read it or skimmed it? No? But you've all eaten millet, what the hell? Like, anyway, so in this report, the World Bank basically ranked something like 35 different food system changes for like how good they would be at like fixing the climate crisis. And you know what came second and beat like all the animal-based ones? Alternative proteins. That's pretty cool, right? Like, and to me, that's not an official endorsement of alternative proteins from the World Bank, but that's like that's pretty darn close, right? And so the World Bank has this remit of funding things that improve the world, improve food security, solve poverty, particularly things that would not have been funded by commercial banks, right? And I think alternative proteins are increasingly fitting that bill, right? Unfortunately, we're seeing like investors are like deserting the alternative protein market. We're asking for governments to step in, but maybe we should also be asking for development finance corporations like the World Bank, its subsidiaries, the International Finance Corporation, the European Investment Bank, to be investing in alternative proteins as a food security fix. And an extra kicker is that we think of alternative proteins, like your vegan burgers and all sorts, as being a Western thing. But there is some public opinion polling to show that in areas of Southeast Asia, in areas of Latin America, there is actually a higher demand for alternative proteins than in Europe. Okay, moving on quickly. So, food security in higher income countries. I'm going to be drawing quite heavily from a report I wrote for the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation in the UK. And something I kind of want to emphasize here is it's no coincidence that it was funded by the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, because food security is a right-wing conversation in Europe, or at least it's not a right-wing conversation, but it is a conversation that particularly appeals to conservatives, right? And so by making food security arguments, we can speak to that kind of segment. We heard in the last panel that our movement doesn't do very well at speaking the language that conservatives kind of want to hear. And so food security arguments can be pretty good for that. So a key thing here is, a key pillar of food security in high-income countries is self-sufficiency, right? We don't want to be dependent on other countries, foreign countries, for our food supply. And factory farming creates the illusion of self-sufficiency. So in the UK, we produce 96% of our own chicken through mostly a factory farming system. We produce 69% of our own pork, 85% of our own meat supply. There's just one problem. The factory farmed system is dependent on imported soy, mostly from Brazil and Argentina. If you pull that soy, the system starts to look a little bit shaky. It's actually quite misleading to say that we are self-sufficient in pork and poultry if our entire system is dependent on imports from another country. And in fact, I did some quick calculations, and it kind of suggests that our self-sufficiency could drop to 54%, or at least ours the UK, could drop to 54%. In poultry, 41% in pork, 57% for our overall meat supply. That's a big drop, right? That's a lot less self-sufficient than we thought we were. And I'm not going to get too much into this in the interest of time, but alternative proteins, if we basically take the land that we use to grow animal feed and we use that as inputs for alternative proteins, we can produce a lot more food. So if we think about it in terms of our protein self-sufficiency, then making swaps from factory farmed meat and then using that land to grow alternative proteins can really increase our protein self-sufficiency, right? This is an argument that I would like to see a little bit more of, because I think it has great potential, right? Securing our country's protein supply. Next one is affordable nutrition. Obviously, I don't need to say too much about this. I don't need to tell this audience that we eat too much meat, right? We don't need cheap meat. Some consumers want it, don't need it. To put a fine point on it, lowering the price of a food that we already overconsume does nothing for food security. When factory poultry farmers talk about we need factory farming because we need chicken to be cheap for consumers as a food security issue, it's just not, right? We need to really push back on that. It's a food that we overconsume. It's a food that we don't need. We don't need the nutrition. In fact, it makes us less healthy, and so it undermines our food security. Instead, we should be focusing on vegetables. It's pretty, well, in most countries in, for example, Europe and the US, people can't afford as much fruit and veg as they would like. And this is the real food security fix we should be pushing. I think I'm a little bit pressed for time, so I'm just going to kind of skim over this. But this was a report from the University of Warwick that suggested that if the UK were to properly invest in its horticulture sector, we could add $500 million to the economy, we could double skilled agricultural jobs to 131,000, and families could afford 30% more fruit and veg. So with the right government investment, we can make huge gains in food security, not by investing in more factory farming to make chicken even cheaper, but by investing in what really matters, which is veg. If you want to know what a great horticulture system looks like, look no further than the Dutch. Do we have any Dutch in the room? No? No Dutch people at all? But you all eat millet? Right, that's amazing. Okay, right. Anyways. You never know how these go, do you? So this is something to Google. The shocking effectiveness of Dutch horticulture. They export tons and tons of vegetables, despite their land being terrible for actually growing veg. It's all high-tech greenhouses. It's really quite amazing. We should all learn from them. And lastly, a key pillar of food security in high-income countries is a thriving farming sector, right? And our farming sectors are not thriving. I don't know if you've noticed. They're parading in the streets. They're dumping literal shit on the Houses of Parliament in Europe and the UK. And so a thriving farming sector is a key kind of aspect of the food security conversation. And something we need to really emphasize here is that factory farming destroys farming jobs, right? It's kind of the point, right? The point is that we can produce more meat without giving farmers jobs, right? In fact, I've done some estimates that suggest that since the 90s, factory farming has eliminated up to 24,000 jobs in the UK. If you did the numbers for Europe, obviously it'd be much, much larger. On the other hand, alternative proteins can create jobs, and not just jobs in tech and bioman and food manufacturing, but also farming jobs. So we have a wonderful environmental think tank in the UK called Green Alliance, and they did a really cool report basically showing that if the UK government were to invest sufficiently in alternative proteins, it could create a ton of jobs. I don't remember how many jobs off the top of my head. Cool. But I do remember that it was 4,000 farming jobs, and that was pretty cool. So an argument we need to be making here is that factory farming does not serve farmers. In fact, it automates away their jobs. And on the other hand, alternative proteins can create jobs for farmers and contribute to a thriving farming sector. And lastly, a secure food system is one that is resistant to shocks, right? And a food system that is diverse is more resistant to shocks. Currently what we do is we grow like 3 or 4 different crops, and then we kind of cram them through the bottleneck of feeding them to 3 or 4 animal species, right? This is a vulnerable system. When African swine fever hits or bird flu hits, it throws not just the meat aisle into chaos, but the entire food system. It becomes a national emergency. On the other hand, if we move to a more plant-based food system, it can shore up the security, the stability of our food system, because we can use a wider variety of foods. So here we've got top crops used today for plant-based protein, and I mean, look, there's a ton of them. And we haven't even begun to explore all the possible protein crops that we could use, right? Here we've got some really great candidates here. This is done by the... Huh? Oh yeah, millet's in there, yeah. This is done by the Good Food Institute, so if you want to look into that, go to their website. And yeah, I mean, we know that a plant-based food system brings diversity to our food system. If you just look at the plant-based milk aisle, right? We've got rice milk, we've got soy milk, we've got oat milk. I've had like potato milk the other day there's a company called Doug, right? Has anyone else had like potato milk before? Yeah, it's okay. It's just. But the point still stands. It allows us to diversify our food system and make it more resistant to shocks. And lastly, people talk about climate change as being a food security issue, and it is, but you need to speak to your audience in a language that they understand. And a lot of people in high-income countries, they might care about climate change, especially if they're liberal. But if they're on the more conservative side, they might not care as much about climate change, partly because they don't think it affects them that much. But it does. So this is a picture from the UK, a farm in the UK. We had an 18-month period a few years ago that was like the wettest on record, and it was absolute chaos for our farming yields. And independent analyses showed that it was the flooding was a lot more likely due to climate change. That was followed by a historic heat wave and drought that killed off, unfortunately, a lot of chickens. And again, that heat wave was made a lot more likely and a lot worse because of climate change. And so climate change is not just something that happens to far-flung countries, it's not just something scientists talk about, it's something that affects the farm down the road from you. It affects the farmers in your country, it affects the yields of the food that feeds your population, right? And that is an angle that appeals to kind of right-of-centre politicians and policymakers, even those who don't normally care that much about climate change. Cool. So, in conclusion, plant-based can and must win the food security conversation. It's being increasingly made, and factory farming is making these arguments. We need to counter them and propose arguments of our own. Secondly, food security is less about calories, it's more about affordable nutrition. Factory farming has no business in the food security conversation, as I've shown. Plant-based and alternative proteins can be powerful food security solutions, whether you are in a high-income country, a lower middle-income country, any country really. And lastly, we need to be using arguments and narratives that resonate with our audience, and food security arguments are another tool in our box for achieving a plant-based future. Thank you very much.
So we actually have a few questions this time. It's been working.
Hey.
I'm going to run through them quite quickly because we've got about 5 minutes or so. So we're going to go through them. So the first question is from Christian, and this is in reference to a visit from the Denmark Vegetarian Society, and it's about the use of like animal-based fertilizers in like alt proteins and plants. So like, is there any way for us to build a plant-based food system not dependent on Russian fertilizer or animal poo? What's the phrase?
Ooh, yeah. So I wonder if... I'm going to pass on this one because I don't really like to answer questions I don't know too much about, and I'm not really an expert when it comes to fertilizers specifically. So if I'm okay, I'm going to pass on that one rather than like kind of give some very vague answer.
Cool, well, with limited time, we're going to move on then. So do you think in the EU it is necessarily better to A, try to capture and take back the food security concept, or B, talk about food resilience as an advocacy PR tool against factory farming?
Yeah, so I think food resilience and these kind of concepts, like, it can come under the food security conversation. Like, buzzwords come and go, and I think we need to essentially be kind of latching. We need to latch onto the buzzwords as they arise, kind of figure out what they mean, figure out how we can use and how we can use them to make our arguments. Obviously, we don't want to lie, right? Like, I mean, I don't think anything here was lying, but I think a lot of these arguments could be, for example, repurposed under different kind of topics, like food resilience. So we could say that alternative proteins improve like food resilience because a system is more resilient if it is more diverse or something like that.
Brilliant. So the final question we have here, and then I won't have time for one more. Under a food security lens, would it be correct to state that a whole food is more secure than its correspondent ultra-processed alternative?
It's not something I've given too much thought to. I don't necessarily. Well, in some ways, if the processing does remove nutrients, then that can be the case. But the processing can sometimes make food cheaper, right? And it can make food cheaper without removing too much of the nutrients. So that can, for example, highly processed foods can come under affordable nutrition. Often it can be weirdly cheaper to process a food and then like supplement it later. Like fortifying, for example, fortified non-dairy milks are more processed. Non-dairy milks are more processed technically than dairy milk, but part of that processing is adding in the micronutrients that actually make it healthy and safe to drink.
Wonderful. I think that's all the questions we had. So, and if we can have a sort of warm round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant.